So, hello, everybody, and welcome to our next episode of Tea and Take. This is Pragya Jamie Marich doing this episode solo with one of my personal teachers and fortunate to call her a collaborator as well, Christine Valters Paintner, who is based in Galway, Ireland. So, hello, Christine, and welcome to our podcast and video series.
Hi, Jamie. Thanks so much. It's wonderful to be with you, as always.
So, when you first reached out to me years ago, I saw that your email came from a URL called Abbey of the Arts. And
Mm-hmm.
as soon as I saw that name, Abbey of the Arts, I just kind of perked up because of both the spiritual connection of it and the expressive arts connection of it. So, for those listening or watching who may not be familiar with Abbey of the Arts, tell us what it is.
Yeah, Abbey of the Arts is a virtual monastery and a global community that we founded. I founded it about, 15 years ago, maybe now.
Mm-hmm.
And my husband has since come to join me with that work. And it's basically started with my deep love of monastic tradition, particularly the desert, Celtic and Benedictine strands of that tradition. And then my great love of the arts, creative arts, especially the expressive arts, as a pathway to, engaging the arts as discovery, as process, as opposed to product, and really helping people see the marriage between kind of those deep contemplative practices of moving into stillness and interior connection with the divine, and then the flow that comes from that, the profound expression that comes out of that through, poetry and movement and photography and other kinds of visual art and song. So our website is basically kind of a resource, and there's a community and there's online retreats as well as live retreats people can join us in. So I live in Ireland now, so we do a lot of pilgrimages and writing retreats in particular, but a whole lot of different resources as well that people can just kind of peruse without making a bigger commitment.
Great. So Satyavani and I recently did an episode on pilgrimage, and I referenced you a couple times that episode as being one of my great teachers about the art of pilgrimage, because I've been on pilgrimage with you. I have read your work on pilgrimage. I participated as a collaborating teacher in a recent online course on it. So I guess if we can just chat about that for a moment, tell us about what pilgrimage means to you and your role in facilitating others in pilgrimage.
Yeah, well, I sometimes describe the pilgrim as the one who courts holy disruption.
Ooh, I like that.
So, and it's sort of like when you hear that, you're like, oh, why would I want to be a pilgrim? Maybe. But this idea that, I suppose, the difference between a tourist and a pilgrim. So a tourist is someone who wants things well packaged and orderly and on time, and to see things in a way that are like not too ruffling of one's own preconceived ideas about how the world should work and all of that. Whereas for me, a pilgrim is someone who journeys somewhere. It might even be an internal journey. Sometimes it's a unintentional journey, like the loss of a job or an illness or something like that. But sometimes it's an external journey that we take intentionally to a sacred place. But when we come as a pilgrim, we arrive with an openness to this holy disruption. In fact, when I say courting, I actually mean that we're not just open to it, but we're actively almost seeking those moments where we start to feel a little bit of that anxiety around what's happening now. Things aren't going the way that I planned them to. And that's one of the beauties of going to a foreign place, culture, language, customs, all of that, because it really has a way of lifting up for us our own internal expectations in a way that I haven't really encountered very commonly in other ways. So it's, and even living in Ireland, having obviously grown up in the States, and even though the language is the same here, technically, there's loads and loads of terms that are different than what American English is. And there's lots of many different cultural differences that are just kind of fun to explore. So even living here over long term feels definitely like an ongoing pilgrimage, because I take delight in those moments when I discover something new, a phrase that I hadn't heard before, or just kind of like a preconceived idea that the Irish people have about themselves or about Americans, and just the way that that invites me into that space of disrupting my own. So the disruption is really about disrupting my own patterns and, preconceived ideas and all of that. So, and the root of the word pilgrim, peregrini is stranger, and the idea is to seek out the strangeness, to go to a strange place and see the strangeness both within us as well as outside of us, because the stranger outside is often triggering the strangeness within us, and gives us it gives us a chance to welcome that part in very, good monastic hospitality ways.
Fantastic. So the one other thing I want to highlight a little bit before we talk about your new work is your background, because this is one of the reasons I resonate so much with you, that your PhD is in Christian spirituality, correct?
Correct.
So you've done a lot of work as a spiritual director, and you are also a yoga teacher and an expressive arts consultant and educator.
Yes.
And we first met when you approached me about dancing mindfulness training. So Christine's also a dancing mindfulness facilitator, which she's weaved into a lot of her other work. So tell us a little bit about how those fuse together for you, those different paths.
Well, I suppose the PhD was part of my. I've always sort of had an academic, sort of scholarly heart to myself, and someone who loves reading and ideas. And I always had, from being quite young, I always thought I would go on to get a PhD. So in some ways, I did it to satisfy that part of myself.
I relate.
Yeah. And then when I moved to the Bay Area to do that, because it was at the Graduate Theological Union in Berkeley, and that's where I discovered the expressive arts. And it was like this amazing homecoming, because I had already been leading arts and retreat work and in spiritual direction. And it was finally like this language that I had for how I was working, which was to look at it in this way that was more process oriented. And so bringing those two strands together, and I suppose one of my gifts is kind of integrating different threads of things and finding ways that the kind of the language of the monastic tradition and the kind of wider Christian mystical tradition, how some of those might find some kind of parallels or kinship with some of this expressive arts material. And then yoga was a practice that I deepened into over many years and fell in love with because of my own journey with chronic illness and autoimmune disease, and how much yoga helped me to come to a homecoming to my own body. And I felt very fortunate, because when I lived in Seattle, I was part of a community called Samaria, and they place great emphasis on the yogic teachings as part of that. So every, time we were in class, there were different, little talks on some of the yogic principles. And I started to realize how much those had in common with particularly the monastic practices, things around kind of simplicity and, just sort of that sense of a deep kinship, the fire and the zeal of the tapas, and the kind of the fire and the zeal of the monk. And so it was, and I became friends with my main teacher there, who did the training, and just felt very nourished by those conversations and bringing those together. And not to say that yoga and Christian monasticism are the same, but obviously there's a lot of kind of similar pathways and desires and directions and all of that. So
tell us about dance, because you have always emphasized the importance of dance in your work too. Even the online community is called the Holy Disorder of Dancing Monks.
It is indeed. A few years ago, I went on a retreat that was a Jungian retreat based on the work of Marion Woodman, who did a lot of what is it called? Body Soul Rhythms is the name of the work, and it's a lot of movement based kind of Jungian work with fairy tales. And I had this incredible. We were invited to dance. It was interesting. It was this piece of music that I hated. I absolutely hated. And of course, it was like the place of breakthrough, which
of course,
sort of that courting that holy disruption. And it was a really profound moment for me of embracing that inner dancer as someone who never felt like I had the body of a yogi or a dancer, or,
whatever that
and
means.
So there, right, exactly. So there are always kind of those little interior walls, and, through Samaria, discovered that yoga is for everybody. And then, through that retreat experience, then deepened into several other conscious dance practices, like, 5 rhythms, and eventually open floor, and of course dancing mindfulness, which gave a lot of great language and sort of awareness to, because my interest really is in, how do we access the wisdom of the body, and how do we give it spontaneous expression in ways, that, and how do we kind of drop into that place of discovery? And I think that's, for me, in part where the contemplative comes in, because it's that sense of being able to drop in and really listen and hear from a different place. And so the contemplative might come through sitting in stillness, but just as often for me, it comes through movement and allowing myself to drop in that way, in a way that's not like prescribed steps from the outside, which it's, if that works for somebody, that's great. But it's a very different experience, I think.
That's something we have in common is kind of steps would be our edge, whereas the freedom is more of.
Yes. I went to a Nia class once because a friend of mine was like, "Oh, you're gonna love it. You love all this kind of organic dance," and there were so many steps. I mean, it seemed like a really great class, but it wasn't for me.
Yeah, that was my experience too. So I wanted to shift gears and talk a little bit about your new book, Dreaming of Stones. It's a collection of poetry that's out by Paraclete Press. So how many books is this for you now?
This is number 12.
This is number 12. So
yes.
I'm very fascinated, as I was sharing with Christine before the interview, that how I read Dreaming of Stones was over the last couple months. I did a poem as part of my morning practice, doing a slow reading of it, and as part of my evening practice. So I felt I had some time to really just sink into the richness of it. So I'm curious, my biggest question for you is, tell me about your process. Is this a collection of years worth of poetry, or is it something that you did kind of in one fell swoop?
Well, really, I've loved poetry my whole life. I've written poetry off and on my whole life. However, when I moved to Ireland, I found a community of poets that was really key, I think, for me, and finally both getting the momentum as well as the courage to put together a collection. And so these poems come largely from, say, the first 5 years that I've lived here in Ireland, and a lot of the poems are inspired by the landscapes or the saints here. And I'm really grateful. I don't think I realized how much I needed that kind of creative community to help inspire me and support me in that process. I didn't know that I wanted to publish a collection of poems until I started meeting with these people every week, and their passion for poetry was just sort of spilled over into my life. And and for me, I don't like sit down at a particular time every day, although morning does tend to work better for me. I also I almost always start a poem in my journal. So I do a lot of journal writing in the morning. Yeah. And I don't necessarily sit down to write a poem, although sometimes I might. It's usually I'm just sitting down to pay attention to whatever's arising. And then oftentimes that will kind of go in the direction of a poem. So it's very organic and fluid.
In your experience, what has been the difference for you between writing poetry and writing prose? Because that's a question I get a lot. So I'm curious to get your take on that.
Yeah, I get that question a lot too. And I mean, in terms of the actual process or a practice of writing it, my prose most often would happen at the computer. And for me, I think because of the kind of prose that I write, tends to be a much more kind of linear, orderly process in that I come up with an idea and then I kind of think about what are the key sort of framework for how to express that and then give people the chapter headings and the themes and how it all hangs together. So there's a part of me that really appeals to a certain part of me that likes that kind of, and in each chapter has the same format and all of that. But with the poetry, like I said, it came out in a much more organic way, and in some ways sort of surprised me that the poems did seem to all kind of fit together, you know what I mean? That they kind of formed a collection, but interestingly, I wasn't thinking about a collection as I was writing the first collection until later in the process. Right. But now that I have a first collection, I am thinking more that way in terms of the second collection, like what the overall theme would be and how that's coming together.
I really like how it's divided into the six sections, from starting with the hours, which I know based on the liturgy of the hours and the hours of the day is an important part of how you use thematic guides in a lot of your other work. The section on monks and mystics was also very the St. Francis at the pub poem was just gave a very human look. And even the St. Hildegard poem, because we obviously share a love for Hildegard, just using those as vehicles to further sink into their humanity was very meaningful for me. And I adore how even the first poem in the collection is called "This Is Not a Poem."
I like that. I call it my not poem.
Right. And as soon as I cracked the book open and noticed that was the first poem, I said, I'm really going to like this. But to that point, a question or I guess a challenge that comes up a lot with my expressive art students and retreatants is I can't write poetry, because obviously a lot of us have that block in our head from elementary school that poetry has to rhyme, which is hogwash. But I guess, I know what my answer is to their questions, but I'm curious to get what your answer would be. If they say, I can't write poetry, how would you address that?
Well, I do lead a lot of writing retreats these days, and they are mainly process oriented, so not kind of workshop oriented. So I do get people who come in who are a little bit intimidated by the process. And I usually start by saying, if the word poetry freaks you out, just think of it as writing in general, and then we'll kind of work on what poetry is over time. You don't have to get it right, you know what I mean, the first time. And even who's to say exactly what poetry is, other than, for me, it really is language condensed. Yeah. So I suppose that's one of the differences for me between poetry and prose, is that I'm trying to get down to the essence of something and say it in the least amount of words that I can, and still express what I want to do. And then I also feel like good poetry is very earthy and connected to the senses. And so, I might lead different exercises that get people in touch with the different senses and begin to see, like, for me, it's a practice of seeing the world, behind the surface of the world. And so how might I write about, just like my dog, curled up beside me in bed, and how might that become a doorway into something, really beautiful and meaningful. And we all deal with our baggage around what we can and can't do. And I think that's the beauty of the expressive arts is, just to dive in and have fun with it. I guess that's the other thing, is I try and encourage people not to take themselves too seriously when they're starting, or even when they're, at any point in the process. I think it's a good practice just to remember, like, you get to do this for yourself. You get to explore and see if there's delight in this mode of expression. And I certainly think that editing and feedback and all of that has a really good place in, certainly in putting together a collection. But I'd say that comes much further down the road. The first step is to really get comfortable with your own voice and with, seeing what comes forth when you give yourself. I do a lot of like timed writing exercises, or some Lectio Divina, which is a contemplative reading of a contemporary poet, and then letting, a line spark, the line of whatever the free writing is that often turns into a poem. So there's different ways to kind of like trick our mind, the part of ourselves that wants to control it and say that we're no good at it. So we might as well not even bother trying.
Right.
So, but it's, if somebody else is holding the space, just like with dancing, it's, I find it easier sometimes to dance when someone else is holding the space and creating that. The same thing with poetry. I think some people are able to dive into it in a way that if they're just sitting and looking at the blank page on their own, they feel a bit of terror.
I know one of the practices that I learned from you, I've really benefited from. It was either when I was reading one of your books or taking one of your courses or both, to use a first line from another poet as a prompt to start your own. And even my newest book, Process Not Perfection, one of the poems I share is based on a first line by Mary Oliver. And then I took it in my own direction. And I just think that's a lovely practice to get people started, because I've learned a lot of my students have it in them, but they may need that gentle nudge or that gentle prompt. And I know for me, a key to writing my own poetry has been really savoring into what I appreciate in the poetry of others. And
yeah. Certainly reading poetry is a beautiful way to drop out of our analytical mind and drop us into that kind of beautiful river of nonlinear language, and I think shapes our poetic kind of way of seeing in ways that we're not totally conscious of.
Right. And an interesting distinction that I picked up somewhere along the way, and I highlight it in Process Not Perfection for people who say, I can't write poetry, is that in poetry, you decide where the lines end. And in prose, the word processor or the margin of the page tends to decide where the lines end. So I often throw that out there as, hopefully that's helpful to some people who are first getting started, who say, I can't do this.
No, that's a great observation as well. There's a lot of creativity in the structure of a poem, and exactly.
And I think on this point, a final question I have for you, because you have guided so many pilgrims and retreatants and students over the years, is what is your best practice? And I know this may vary from person to person, but how do you deal with the I can't? I can't do this. I can't write. I'm not creative. I don't have a body for this. I'm blocked. I mean, some people may not verbalize it as I'm blocked, but how do you address that?
Well, I suppose I start with hospitality, and that idea of first softening towards that part of ourselves that says we can't do this, and meeting that part of ourselves with some compassion and some grace and some curiosity, and to see what it might be there for. That oftentimes it's that part of ourselves that developed really early on. So I think just dismissing it isn't always that helpful. And because people are often, coming to these retreats for some sort of creative guidance, there's clearly the desire there. So, for me, it ends up being kind of an inner conversation between the different parts of ourselves, the part that shuts things down, the part that judges ourselves, but also the part that's like seeking that aliveness, seeking that, and then just inviting people into that playful experimental space. Like, what would you do if there weren't any right or wrong, you can't pass or fail, this is just purely for you? And so I think so few of us actually spend time trying something just for the pure pleasure of it or frustration of it, because I will say, I think there's great value in trying to do something new that's outside of our sphere of comfort. I learned that when I tried to take an Irish language class. And I just truly discovered, wow, this language is very different than what I'm used to. And anyway, it was a very humbling experience in all the best ways. And so I think there's lots of different layers that people can work with. But I think going back to that idea of kind of letting it be a playful thing, and then seeing what happens when I just give myself a little bit of space, and maybe making the art or the poem in response to that voice I can't, like letting that be the starting point
That's the
for
problem.
whatever yeah, exactly.
Absolutely.
That could be usually a good doorway in. It's a lot of energy in that I can't.
Sure.
So.
So I know you and John are preparing for your Jubilee sabbatical year, which is, I'm very excited for you. Can you, I guess the last thing I was hoping you can plug or talk about a little bit are the new moon retreats that Abbey of the Arts are offering in the year that you're on sabbatical.
Yeah, well, we're very grateful to be have been able to plan for this time of sabbatical, and as part of that, we have kind of a whole online sort of program that helps support all the things that the Abbey does, kind of behind the scenes. And there's different components to that. One of which is a series of new little mini retreats on the new moon, and we're really grateful to have a wonderful wisdom council of which you are a member. A very valued member, and each of those Wisdom Council members is creating a little, like a retreat that you could do in 2 to 3 hours, and they're on the new moons, but they're also tied to whatever the seasonal time of year might be. Yeah, so it's I think a lovely chance to just dip in and also to get different perspectives because we have a nice spectrum of practitioners who are on our Wisdom Council. So.
And I'm doing the first one, right?
You are.
First in
You
July.
just dove right in.
Yeah. I was very happy to offer that. So, well, Christine, it's always a pleasure to talk with you, either formally or over an interview like this. Once again, I want to encourage my listeners and viewers to pick up a copy of Dreaming of Stones, and also check out Abbey of the Arts to read about some of Christine's other fascinating body of work. If I always say, whatever you're looking for, she's probably written something to address it. As many of you who follow my work know, the book on the wisdom of the body is something I had a chance to collaborate with as well. And it's just one of my absolute favorites if you're kind of stuck in this body shame around approaching expressive arts.
Wonderful. Thank you, Jamie.
So all the best to you, and thanks to our listeners and viewers for joining us for another episode of Tea and Take.